The medbay smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, and the specific kind of silence that follows violence. Casimir Voss sat upright on the cot, not because he felt well, because sitting upright was a decision, and he was a man who made decisions the way other men breathed without stopping to consider whether he felt like it. His left arm was bandaged from elbow to shoulder, 3 ribs wrapped, one eye still swollen enough to have his field of vision. The medic had told him to lie down 4 times. He had nodded politely each time and remained sitting. He was writing in his journal. Not about the attack, not yet. He was writing names. The 3 names the medic had given him in a flat voice that meant the medic had delivered this kind of news before and had learned to make it sound like weather. Doran Kell, Sipa Vante, young Rael, who had been 26 and had brought dried fruit from his home colony every Monday morning and left some on everyone's desk without saying anything about it. 3 names. He wrote them cleanly, set the pen down, looked at the names for a long time. Then he turned the page and began his notes. The attack on Calith, 7, was broadcast on open diplomatic channels. That was the point of it. The Vreth Dominion had not stumbled into an ambush, they had staged one, carefully, with full awareness of the station's monitoring arrays, which meant they wanted the footage. They wanted the galaxy to see a human diplomatic convoy overwhelmed, staff bleeding on a neutral station's transit corridor. The senior ambassador dragged across the floor. A message. Clear as anything. This is what your people look like when we decide they should. The Vreth communique arrived 14 hours after the attack. It expressed regret for the incident. It used the word unfortunate twice. It did not use the word apology once. There was a kind of precision in that, a bureaucratic cruelty, the sort that knew exactly which words to leave out. Every senior member of the Human Foreign Service read the communique and felt their blood pressure climb. Ambassador Thessa Marev, who ran the Eastern Corridor delegations, sent Voss a message that was 4 paragraphs of tightly controlled fury and ended with a request for his authorization to escalate to the Security Assembly. He read it. Set it aside. Director Polan, back on Earth, sent a message that was 2 sentences. Tell me what you need. Whatever it is. He was a good director. He understood that sometimes the right move was to hand someone the room. Voss appreciated that. He sent 1 reply to Marev. 3 sentences. He was recovering well. He had a meeting scheduled with the Vreth trade attaché. Please hold all escalation requests, pending that meeting. He could picture her face when she read it. He had known Thessa Marev for 19 years, and he knew precisely the expression she made when she thought someone was being catastrophically stupid. He almost smiled. Calith, 7, was a neutral station, a long spine of corridors and docking rings and conference suites, suspended at the gravitational midpoint of 3 different sovereign territories. It existed specifically because no one could agree on whose space the conversations should happen in. 14 civilizations used it regularly. The coffee was bad. The acoustics were worse. Voss had spent more months of his life here than he'd spent at home. Across all the years, he'd still had a home to count. He walked the transit corridor the next morning. He walked it slowly because of the ribs. He walked it at 0600 because no one else was there. He stopped at the section where the attack had happened. The station's cleaning systems had done their work. There was nothing to see. Just corridor. Just floor. Just the flat light of a place designed to be nobody's in particular. He stood there for a while. Doran Kell had been with him for 11 years. Sipa Vante, 6. Rael had been his 3rd posting. He'd been nervous and earnest, and had asked too many questions in briefings, the kind that made senior staff exchange glances. But Voss had always answered them because the questions were good ones dressed in an apologetic voice. He did not cry. Not because he couldn't. Because he was saving it for somewhere it would mean something, and a cleaned corridor on a neutral station at 0600 was not that place. He went back to his room and opened the journal. The meeting with the Vreth trade attaché was scheduled for 3 days out. Ambassador Voss spent those 3 days doing what he had spent 30 years learning to do, reading. Financial records, trade agreements, resource extraction contracts, shipping route registrations, arbitration outcomes, and the dense, small print of 40 interstellar commercial treaties. He had always been the kind of diplomat other diplomats underestimated at first. He didn't look like a weapon. He looked like a bureaucrat. He wore the same style of gray jacket in rotation. He ordered the same tea. He never raised his voice in chambers. What they never quite understood was that the paperwork was where he lived. He had spent his career inside systems, trade systems, legal systems, financial systems, the way a fish lives in water. He had learned that every system had fault lines. Every agreement had a clause someone had stopped reading. Every relationship between civilizations was held together, underneath the ceremonies and the speeches, by money and access, and the quiet terror of losing both. He read for 3 days. He made notes. The journal filled up. On the second night, he turned to a blank page and drew a diagram. Circles, connecting lines, numbered nodes. He looked at it for a long time. Some of what he needed was already there. Some of it would take months to build. He picked up the pen and began marking the nodes he could already reach. The Vreth-Attach's name was Vorath Sen. He was polished in the particular way that mid-tier expansionist powers produced their officials confident in the specific register of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. He arrived at the meeting with 2 aides and an expression of patient condescension. He had been briefed, presumably, that the human was recovering from injuries. He looked at Voss across the table with something that stopped just short of visible satisfaction. Voss poured tea, asked if Sen would like some. Sen declined. Voss drank his own and set the cup down and opened his folder. The meeting was procedural, quiet. Voss asked about minor adjustments to existing freight routing agreements. He flagged a tariff inconsistency in a 6-year-old contract. He asked, almost as an afterthought, about the renewal timeline on 2 trade corridor registrations. Sen answered everything with the ease of a man who thought the conversation was beneath him. He was not wrong that it was small. He was wrong about why. An hour in, Voss thanked him for his time. Sen left with his aides, the expression still on his face. Voss sat alone in the conference room, finished his tea, took out the journal, and marked 3 more nodes on the diagram. 19 marked now, 24 to go. He closed the journal, picked up his bag, and walked back to his room at the same unhurried pace he did everything. The corridor was empty. The station hummed around him with its low, recycled air hum. 3 names were still on the first page of the journal. He hadn't forgotten them. That was the whole point. 8 months is a long time to watch nothing happen. That was how it looked. That was the point. Ambassador Thessamarev stopped asking Voss about escalation after the 3rd week. Not because she agreed with him, but because he gave her the same 3-sentence response every time. And she eventually ran out of new ways to be frustrated by it. Director Poland filed the required incident reports with the Security Assembly and made it clear, in the careful language of someone who has learned when to leave doors open and when to close them, that humanity was evaluating options, which meant nothing, which was the point. The Vreth Dominion issued no further statements. They had sent their message. They were waiting for the response they expected, an emotional escalation, a demand for sanctions, a block of human diplomats performing outrage in chambers. The kind of response they had seen from smaller species. The kind of response that could be managed. Casimir Voss sent new response. He attended meetings. He drank bad coffee on Kalith. 7. He filed reports. He calmed Director Poland every Tuesday at 0900 and discussed logistics in a voice that gave nothing away, which was a kind of communication in itself. Poland, to his credit, understood that. What Voss actually did, what no one was watching closely enough to see, was work. The Vreth Dominion's external economy ran on 3 things. Resource extraction from contested frontier territories, where their contracts were aggressive, and their oversight was non-existent. Shipping corridor access through the Soleni Compact's border regions, which they had negotiated at terms so favorable it bordered on theft. And a financing arrangement with the Kalith Commercial Bank, an institution old enough and large enough that most civilizations just assumed it was permanent, the way they assumed certain stars would always be where they were. Voss had known about these 3 pillars for a long time. Most senior diplomats did. The Vreth's economic architecture was not a secret. The reason nothing had been done about it was that untangling it would require coordination across a dozen unrelated parties, each of whom had their own interests, their own timelines, their own reasons for not wanting to move first. Coordination. That was the word. He was very good at coordination. The first thread was the Soleni Compact. Voss had met the Soleni's chief trade minister twice in the past 4 years, once at a summit, once at an arbitration session, where they had sat on the same side of a table that had nothing to do with either of them. He had liked her. She was sharp in the way of someone who knew exactly what everyone in a room wanted and spent her time deciding which of those wants were worth engaging with. He requested a consultation, not about the Vreth, about a completely unrelated matter, a routing efficiency study that genuinely needed input from the Soleni about their border corridor traffic. It was real work. He had been intending to do it for months. In the middle of that meeting, he mentioned offhand, almost incidentally, that he had recently been reviewing the original terms of the Soleni-Vreth corridor agreement and found several clauses that seemed to predate the current traffic volumes by a significant margin. He wondered if the Soleni had found the same thing. He was not suggesting anything. He was merely noting it. The trade minister looked at him for a moment. She said she would have her team review it. He thanked her and moved on. The second thread was a regulatory body called the Interstellar Commerce Standards Council. It was the kind of institution that existed in the background of everything. It issued compliance, guidance, that most financial entities followed, not because they were required to, but because being flagged by the ICSC was expensive and inconvenient in ways that compounded over time. Voss had consulted for the ICSC twice. He knew 3 of the current senior reviewers personally. He was asked to participate in a working group on lending transparency standards. He said yes. He attended 4 sessions over 3 months and contributed thoughtful, well-sourced input on how frontier territory resource extraction loans were typically structured and what kinds of documentation gaps created systemic risk for the lenders involved. He never named the Caliph Commercial Bank. He never needed to. The ICSC reviewers were professionals. They knew how to read a pattern. 6 months in, the Vreth Intelligence Service's Mid-Level Analysis Division produced a report. The analyst who wrote it was named Keth Vaughn. He was not the most senior person in his division. He was not the most liked. He had a reputation for connecting things that his superiors preferred to treat as separate, and this reputation had not helped his career. He had noticed, over the previous months, a series of events that looked, individually, like bad luck. The Soleni Compact had quietly commissioned an independent review of their corridor agreements with the Vreth. A routine thing, on the surface. Except the firm conducting the review had been recommended by a third party who had been introduced to the Soleni trade minister at a meeting 6 months ago, a meeting with a human diplomat. Keth had found that connection after 11 hours of cross-referencing attendee lists. The ICSC working group had produced new compliance guidance that, in its technical language, described documentation gaps that were almost perfectly specific to frontier territory extraction financing. The Caliph Bank's legal team had already flagged it internally. Again, no obvious connection to anything. Except, one of the working group's participants was on record as having met with a Vreth trade attaché approximately 4 days after an incident on Caliph. 7. 2 threads. Different sources. Different timelines. The same human. Keth wrote the report carefully. He was careful because he knew how his superiors read things, and he knew that what he was describing, a single mid-level diplomat, recovering from injuries, dismantling their economic architecture through meeting requests and consultation invitations, would sound either paranoid or embarrassing. Probably both. He submitted it anyway. His superior read it, set it down, told him that what he was describing was not how diplomats worked, that the human was clearly pursuing routine post-incident engagement to demonstrate institutional resilience. That Keth was pattern-matching noise into a conspiracy because it was more interesting than accepting that an old human had attended some meetings and nothing more. Keth did not argue. He went back to his desk and opened a new file. Voss, on the night Keth's report was being dismissed, was on a comm call. His daughter's name was Mira. She was 31. She worked in civil infrastructure on a station 2 sectors away from anywhere Voss had ever been posted, which had been, for a long time, entirely deliberate on her part. Their calls were short. They had been short for years, the residue of a life where he had been present everywhere except the places that counted. He asked if she was well. She said yes. She asked about his arm. He said it was mostly healed. She said she had heard about Caliph 7. She didn't say it like a question, but it had a question inside it. He said he was handling it. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I know you are. That's what worries me sometimes. He didn't have an answer for that. He told her he'd call again soon. She said okay. The call ended. He sat in the quiet of his room on Caliph 7 with the journal open in his lap. 29 nodes marked now. He picked up the pen. He was not doing this for commendations. Not for the Foreign Service. Not for whatever story the history files would eventually tell about this period. Doran Kell. Sipavante. Young Rael with his fruit. He was doing it because debts were real things. Because he was the kind of man who had spent 30 years learning exactly how the architecture of power was held together, and he was not going to pretend he didn't know how to use that knowledge just because the weapon didn't look like one. 14 nodes left. He had time. Bad luck is a story civilizations tell themselves when the truth is too inconvenient to read. The Vreth Dominion had a word for it. Roughly translated, it meant the accumulation of unfortunate circumstance, a polite phrase for a thing that happened to other, smaller powers, not to them. They were an established force, a mid-tier empire with 2 centuries of careful expansion, the kind of entity that created bad luck for others, not the kind that received it. And yet, in the 7th month after Caliph 7, the Soleni Compact announced the results of their Corridor Agreement review. The original terms, signed 14 years ago, ratified during a period when the Soleni were economically contracted and politically isolated, were found to be significantly below current market value. The compact formally notified the Vreth that renegotiation would begin within 60 days. This was their right. The treaty said so. Buried in a subsection that had been negotiated by a Soleni minister who was long retired, and a Vreth attaché, who had probably assumed the clause would never matter, there was a review mechanism. Standard language. The kind that gets copied from agreement to agreement without anyone thinking hard about what it means, until someone thinks hard about what it means. The Vreth legal team spent 3 days looking for the angle of attack. There wasn't one. It was a clean, legitimate process. They called it an inconvenience and moved on. In the 8th month, the Caliph Commercial Bank's Compliance Department completed an internal audit triggered by the ICSC's new guidance on frontier territory extraction lending. The audit identified 17 active loan portfolios that contained documentation gaps now flagged under the new standards. 7 of those portfolios belonged to the Vreth Dominion. The bank did not freeze the accounts. It sent a formal notification requesting supplementary documentation within 90 days. Standard procedure. Entirely routine. What was not routine was the secondary effect. The bank's risk assessment models, updated to reflect the ICSC guidance, quietly reclassified the Vreth's loan categories. Not a default. Not a crisis. A recategorization which meant higher reserve requirements for the bank, which meant higher interest charges for the Vreth, which meant the cost of financing their frontier expansion had increased by a margin that would, over 4 years, amount to something that felt, if you were sitting inside the Vreth treasury, like a slow leak you couldn't find the source of. Keth Vaughn, in his mid-level office in the Vreth Intelligence Service, added 2 new lines to his private file. He had started keeping the file at home. The 3rd thread pulled in a way even Voss had not entirely predicted. The frontier territories where the Vreth ran, their extraction operations were not empty. They contained 3 small population species, the Orath, the Denville, and the Sethnara, none of whom had sufficient political mass to challenge the Vreth's contracts individually. What they had was a treaty mechanism called the Frontier Compact Petition, which allowed non-sovereign entities to bring economic grievances to the Multilateral Trade Review Board, provided they could demonstrate coordinated harm across at least 2 species and provide independent documentation of the contract terms in question. They had never been able to do this before. Coordination was hard. Documentation was expensive. They didn't have the resources or the connections. But 3 months ago, a human diplomat on Calith, 7, had quietly facilitated an introduction through a third party, through a legal assistance body he had recommended to someone at a conference, through 2 layers of perfectly deniable referral between the Orath Trade Council and a documentation firm that specialized in exactly this kind of filing. The Frontier Compact petition landed at the Trade Review Board on a Tuesday. It was airtight. Keth Vaughn submitted his second report on a Thursday. He had learned from the first one. This time, he didn't frame it as a theory. He framed it as a timeline. 47 data points, sourced and cross-referenced. He laid them in chronological order and let them sit on the page without drawing conclusions, because he understood that his superiors would reject conclusions but could not reject a timeline. He walked into his section director's office and handed it over without speaking. His director read it slowly. Keth watched the man's face do a sequence of things. Dismissal. Rereading. Something that looked like the beginning of concern. And then the expression of someone who did not want the concern to become official. You're saying one human did this. Keth said he was saying the timeline was consistent with one human's movements and meeting records over an 8-month period. He's a diplomat. He was injured. He's been doing routine post-incident engagement. Keth said yes. That was one interpretation. His director looked at the timeline again. What do you want me to do with this? Keth said he wanted it escalated to the Security Council. His director said he'd consider it. Keth knew what that meant. He went back to his desk. He saved a copy of the file on a private encrypted drive. He labeled it with a name, a date, and a single line of text that he did not share with anyone. The line read, "We attacked the wrong human. Voss received the summit invitation on a Friday. The Galactic Multilateral Summit on Trade and Collective Security, held every 3 years, attended by 40-plus civilizations. The kind of event that produced long communiques full of language everyone agreed to and almost no one implemented. He had attended 6 of them. He had found most of them useful in the way that all large rooms full of decision-makers were useful if you knew what you were actually there to do. He accepted the invitation. He also sent a message to a contact in the Multilateral Policy Office, a Chitauri diplomat named Solon Varek, who was methodical and well-respected, and who had been quietly frustrated for years by the lack of a workable framework for shared trade corridor governance. Voss said he had been developing some ideas. He asked if Varek might be interested in reviewing a draft before the summit. Varek said yes, immediately. Voss spent the next 3 weeks writing. Not notes. Not diagrams. A full policy framework, 70 pages, detailed and sourced, with economic modeling attached. He had been thinking about parts of it for years. Other parts had come together over the last 8 months, as the picture clarified. He sent the draft to Varek. He sent modified versions to 3 other senior diplomats from different civilizations, each tailored to speak directly to that civilization's specific trade interests. He was not deceptive about it. Each version was honest about what the framework was. He simply made sure each recipient could see, clearly, where their own advantage was. That was the thing about good architecture. You didn't have to manipulate people into standing on it. You just had to build it in a place they were already trying to go. On the night before he departed for the summit, Voss sat at his desk on Calith, 7 for the last time. He opened the journal. The diagram was there 43 nodes, 41 marked, 2 left. He would close them at the summit. He turned back to the first page, 3 names. The same ink, the same date, unchanged. He had been asked, twice in the past months, by junior staff who had been there on Calith, 7, if he was okay. Both times, he had said yes. Both times he had meant, I am doing the only thing that makes sense to do. Whether that was okay was a question for later. He packed the journal in his bag. He packed the gray jacket. He packed the folder with the framework document, already signed by 4 co-sponsors. He took one last look at the room. The recycled air smell. the flat light of a place that belonged to no one. He turned it off and walked out. The summit was in 9 days. He had work to do. The summit station was called Marinville, and it was enormous in the way that buildings are enormous when they are designed to make individuals feel small. 40-meter atrium ceilings, corridors wide enough for 6 delegations to walk abreast without acknowledgement, conference suites, named after historical treaties that most of the civilizations attending had not been party to. Casimir Voss arrived early. He always did. He found his assigned suite, set his bag on the desk, and opened the window panel to look at the docking rings below. 40-plus civilizations. Hundreds of ships. The summit staff was still arranging signage. A junior coordinator was arguing with a logistics system about seating arrangements in a voice that carried all the way up. Ordinary chaos. He found it settling. He took out the journal. 1 node left. He had closed the 42nd on the transit here, a short call with Solon Varek that confirmed the final co-sponsorship. The last node was the vote itself. That one would close in 4 days. He put the journal away and went to introduce himself to the catering staff, because in his experience, the catering staff always knew which meeting rooms were double booked and which elevators were unreliable. And that information was worth more than most briefing documents. The summit opened with speeches. There were 11 of them. Voss sat through all 11 with the practiced stillness of a man who had long ago made peace with the fact that most speeches were for the speaker, not the listener. He took notes occasionally. Not about the speeches, about the room who sat near whom, which delegations exchanged looks during which remarks, where the tension was pooling. The Vreth delegation sat 3 rows from the front. Vorath Sen was there, the polished attaché from the Caliph, 7 meeting. He had been promoted since then. Voss had noted it in the delegate listings. The attack had probably looked, from inside the Vreth structure, like a success. The human had been wounded. The response had been nothing. The attaché got promoted. Voss made no note about this. He already knew it. The framework was introduced on the 2nd day. Solon Varek presented it, as agreed. This was also deliberate. Varek had standing, relationships, and a reputation for even-handedness that Voss did not want to contaminate by being the visible face of the document. The framework had 4 co-sponsors from 4 different civilizations. It was introduced as a collective initiative. Voss sat in the 3rd row and listened. The framework was, structurally, a trade governance architecture for shared corridor access and resource extraction oversight. It established common documentation standards. It created a multilateral arbitration mechanism for disputes. It opened access to 6 major trade corridors on a shared cost model that made them cheaper and more efficient for almost every signatory. It was good policy. Genuinely. That was not a disguise, it was the whole point. He had built something real, something that worked. Something that 30 civilizations would look at and see their own advantage reflected back. He had simply also built it in a shape that fit around the Vreth like a jaw. The framework's arbitration mechanism required independent oversight of resource extraction contracts in frontier territories. This was framed as a transparency standard. It was also the exact mechanism the Vreth had blocked for a decade, because full transparency on their frontier operations would expose contract terms that had been exploitative enough to trigger renegotiation demands from 3 small population species. The corridor access model used a shared registration system. Civilizations outside the system could still use the corridors, but at non-member rates, which were structured to reflect the full cost of maintenance rather than the subsidized cooperative rate. Civilizations inside the system benefited from the subsidy. The Vreth, who currently accessed 2 of the 6 corridors through preferential bilateral agreements that the framework would supersede, would face either full transparency or full cost. There was no third option. It had taken Voss 8 months to build a document where those consequences were the logical output of good governance rather than punitive targeting. He had checked it 14 times. There was no seam showing. The chamber debated for 6 hours. The Vreth delegation's response came on the 3rd day. Vorath Sen addressed the chamber directly. His tone was controlled, but the control had a tightness to it, the register of a man who had been up very late the night before, being told things he hadn't been prepared for. He argued that the framework was unbalanced, that the oversight mechanism was an infringement on sovereign commercial practice, that the corridor access model unfairly disadvantaged civilizations with existing bilateral agreements. He was not wrong about any of this as a description of the framework's effects. He could not explain, in that room, why those effects were targeted without implying that the Vreth had something to hide from the oversight mechanism. And he could not call it targeted without evidence, because on paper, it wasn't. It was a governance framework supported by 4 co-sponsors and drafted in language that any independent legal review would call fair. 3 other delegations asked questions. Varric answered them. The answers were thorough and patient. Sen made a second statement. He called the framework rushed and asked for a delay in the vote. Varric noted, politely, that the framework had been in circulation for review for 23 days before the summit, and that 4 civilizations had already signed on as co-sponsors. He did not know what delay would accomplish that 23 days of review had not. The chamber had nothing to say to that. The vote happened on the 4th day. 31 civilizations voted to adopt. 4 abstained. 2 declined and were noted. The Vreth delegation declined. Varric thanked the chamber. The co-sponsors signed the formal document. Someone in the back started a low round of applause that built across the room in the slow way. Genuine relief sounds different from ceremony. Voss did not applaud. He was already writing in the journal. He closed the last node. 43. Done. The Vreth requested a formal censure motion against the human diplomatic delegation before the session ended. The motion alleged coordinated interference in Vreth commercial affairs, diplomatic bad faith, and what they called structured economic aggression through multilateral instruments. The chamber reviewed the motion. Then it reviewed the framework. Then it reviewed the record of meetings, consultations, and introductions that the motion was presumably based on. The record showed a diplomat attending meetings, consulting on policy, co-facilitating introductions between parties with shared interests, drafting a governance framework now signed by 31 civilizations. There was nothing to censure. The motion failed 11-1, with the 1 being the Vreth themselves. Abstentions from parties who did not want to antagonize the Vreth formally, but also had no interest in defending them. Sen sat very still when the result was read out. Voss, across the room, did not look at him. There was a small reception after the session. Polite noise, bad wine, the usual performance of diplomatic warmth. Voss stood near a window with a glass he wasn't drinking and let people come to him, which they did, because that was how these events worked after a successful outcome. 3 civilizations expressed interest in joining the framework as late signatories. He took their contact information and said someone from the policy office would follow up. Varric found him near the end of the evening. He said, "You built that very carefully." Voss said the framework had been a genuine collective effort. Varric looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who had decided to accept an answer he knew was not the whole answer. He said, "Whatever the reason it exists, it's good work. It will hold." Voss said he was glad. Varric left. The room thinned. Voss put down the glass and took out the journal. He turned to the first page. 3 names. He looked at them the way he had looked at them every night for 8 months. He did not feel triumphant. He hadn't expected to. He felt the way you feel when you finish something that needed finishing, not light, not satisfied, just done in the particular way that done things are done. Completed. Discharged. A weight that had been in his chest since the medbay on Calith. 7. Not removed, but settled. He turned to a fresh page. At the top, he wrote a name. It was not the Vreth's name. 6 months after the summit, the Vreth Dominion submitted to arbitration. There was no ceremony for it, no announcement with their seal, a legal filing, routed through the Trade Review Board, in formal bureaucratic language that translated roughly as, "We accept the oversight mechanism and request integration into the corridor access framework under standard member terms." 11 sentences, the kind of document designed to be as invisible as possible. It was reported by 2 trade news services as a diplomatic breakthrough. One called it an encouraging sign of multilateral cooperation. Another described it as the Vreth joining the framework family. Both pieces were accurate in the same way that describing a flooded basement as moist is technically accurate. No one called it what it was. Voss read both pieces on his tablet, on a transport heading to a different station, a different assignment, a different room that would smell like recycled air and belong to no one in particular. He read them once, set the tablet face down on the seat beside him, and looked out the port window at the dark between stars for a while. Then he picked up the journal. The Vreth's internal transition had taken 4 months after the summit. Keth Vaughn knew some of it. He knew what his clearance allowed him to know, which was less than what he could deduce, which was less than what had actually happened. But the shape was visible enough. The financial pressure had compounded. The Soleni corridor renegotiation had reached a conclusion that reduced the Vreth's transit revenues by a measurable percentage. The Calith Bank's new reserve requirements had quietly increased the cost of frontier expansion to a point where 2 planned operations had been deferred. The Frontier Compact petition had gone to full review, and the Trade Board's preliminary findings were not favorable. And now, 31 civilizations were operating inside a framework that made corridor access cheaper for members and expensive for everyone else. And the Vreth's frontier extraction model needed that corridor access, and the cost differential was not going away. The economics had made the decision. The politics had dressed it up. Keth filed a final note in his private file. He had kept it for nearly a year now. The file had grown from a timeline into something closer to a case study, though he would never call it that out loud and would never share it without being very certain of his audience. At the bottom, below the line he had written 8 months ago times. We attacked the wrong human times, he added one more. He didn't fight back. He just built something we couldn't stand outside of. He saved the file, closed it, went to get bad station coffee, and did not think about it for the rest of the day, because some things were better left as private knowledge. Mira Voss was good at finding things her father had never told her. She had learned this skill young, because he was the kind of man who gave you the shape of a thing without the details. And if you wanted the details, you had to go find them yourself. She had spent a long time being angry about this. She had spent the last several years deciding that anger was a response to an expectation. And the expectation was her problem to manage, not his. She found out about the framework through a colleague who worked in infrastructure procurement and mentioned, in passing, that the new corridor access rates had changed their regional cost projections significantly. She looked it up. Read the framework. Found the co-sponsoring names. Did not find her father's name. She looked at the timeline. She looked at the date the framework had been introduced, against the date of Calith. 7. She looked at the distance between those 2 points and thought about what she knew of her father, which was considerable, and what she knew about how he worked, which was also considerable, and she came to a conclusion that she sat with for 2 days before she calmed him. He answered on the 3rd ring. He always answered, now. That had changed in the past year, and she had noticed, but not mentioned it. She said, I heard about what you did. He said, I attended some meetings. She said, Dad. He was quiet. She said, was it enough? Another quiet. The kind he used when he was deciding how honest to be. She had learned to wait it out. He said, it was what was possible. She didn't push it. She had learned that too, the difference between what he could say and what he was carrying, and the knowledge that pushing on the second wouldn't open it. It would just make him close the first. She asked about his arm. He said it was fine. She said she was coming to the sector for a conference in 2 months, and asked if that was anywhere near where he'd be. He checked. He said yes, he could make the timing work. She said okay. He said, I'd like that. He said it plainly, the way he said things that cost him something. She recognized the register. She said, me too. The call ended. She sat with it for a moment. Then she went back to work. Voss arrived at his new posting on a Tuesday. It was a station called Verath Hub, smaller than Calith. 7, less cosmopolitan. The kind of place where the diplomatic traffic was second tier, and the assignments went to people being rotated in to rest, or being rotated out to obscurity. He had asked for it specifically. Poland had looked at the request for a long time before approving it without comment. He unpacked in the same order he always did. Clothes, tablet, folder, journal. He set the journal on the desk and didn't open it. He stood at the window instead and looked at the station's external ring, where a few ships were docked and a maintenance crew was doing something to one of the port arms with the slow, deliberate movements of people who knew the job and didn't need to hurry. He thought about Doran Kell, who had been quiet and thorough and had never once been late to a briefing. He thought about Sipavante, who had been the best sight translator he had ever worked with and who had a laugh that could change the temperature of a room. He thought about young Rael, who had brought fruit on Mondays and who had asked too many questions and who had been 26. He thought about them for a long time. Then he sat down at the desk and opened the journal to the fresh page. The name at the top was not the Vreth's name. It was the name of a different power. A larger one, an older one, the kind that had been operating with comfortable impunity for long enough to have stopped noticing who they stepped on. They had stepped on something 3 years ago. A small thing. A trade delegation from a non-sovereign people who had no political mass and no way to push back. Voss had been following it from a distance for a long time, putting it aside, waiting until he had the resources and the standing and the right architecture of relationships to do anything useful. He had those things now. He picked up the pen and started writing. He was 60 years old, and his ribs had healed, and his arm was mostly fine, and there were names on the first page of the journal that he carried with him everywhere, and he was a man who paid his debts in full. He had time. He had patience. He had 30 years of knowing exactly how the systems worked, and where the fault lines were, and which threads, pulled in the right sequence, made the whole thing come apart. The galaxy had looked at him on the floor of a transit corridor on Calith 7 and seen a wounded bureaucrat. It had not yet learned what that meant. It would.